All right, welcome to Lecture 10, Part 3. Your outline for this week is here. We are in week 31. Your assignments for this week are your Journal 31. You have 2 readings for that this week, plus this lecture. Your readings are a little bit lighter because you have 2 assignments here. You have Unit 11, Document Set 2. This document set is on the Johnson administration. And then your other assignment this week is the War on Poverty speech evaluation. You just did an evaluation last week on a speech from Kennedy. This week you will do a speech on Johnson. Don't forget that all 3 of these assignments are due Friday by 11:59. Any questions or issues, please let me know. Now, this past week in class, I noted that throughout the 1960s, there will be a number of assassinations. These assassinations will take away civil rights leaders, political leaders, civil rights leaders, and political leaders, having a foot in both movements there. And these assassinations illustrate to us that throughout the 1960s, not only do we have turmoil abroad, being more involved in Vietnam and having that strife outside of our borders, but we will also see that within ourselves we are at odds. And these leaders that we see lose their lives will represent that here on our own soil, here at home. The first assassination that we have is Medgar Evers, 1963. During World War II, Evers volunteered for the U.S. Army and participated in the Normandy invasion, so served our country during World War II. He was from Mississippi. He attended school in Mississippi until he joined the Army in 1943. Despite the fact that he participated in the battle at Normandy, Evers found that he would constantly have to face the fact that at home he was not awarded the same rights that he was fighting for abroad, and he found that that was because of his skin color, and that gave him no freedoms, especially when he went to vote in a local election and he and 5 friends were forced away from that election at gunpoint. This is going to lead to Evers joining the NAACP. Remember, that is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, where he will work to encourage poor African Americans to register to vote. Because the only way to cause change in this movement is to register to vote and get people in office that will make changes. Now, it's easy for me to say this, but there have been many hurdles put in place to stop people from voting, people of color from voting. And it is not just in this time where we're looking at the 1960s where we see voter intimidation quite literally through violence, but we saw that in the form of poll taxes. We saw that in the form of literacy tests. We saw it in the form of the grandfather clause. All of these different measures were taken then to stop people from voting. Now we see it in a kind of different light. We are seeing voter suppression laws being passed around the United States, setting restrictions to voting, standing in line, not being able to have food and water and things like that in line. This stops people from waiting in those long lines. Those long lines are often in heavily populated neighborhoods where you see Black and people of color, minority neighborhoods, or where you see those long lines. And if that can't happen, then they can't vote. Another way that we see voter suppression in current times is through felons not being able to vote or not being able to immediately vote, having a grace period where they cannot vote once they are released from jail. And we just saw in New York, there was a law passed where when a felon comes out of jail, they have to be given a voter registration form on the same day of release. So we're seeing a kind of changing of the tides in both directions, with more voter suppression in some states and with less, trying to decrease that suppression. But that voter suppression that Evers was fighting for is still very prevalent in our society today. Evers will also be involved in the investigation of the murder of Emmett Till. He will come out against those that had killed Till, and that will put him to be a target of many threats. In May of 1963, a Molotov cocktail was thrown into the carport of his home, and that's just 5 days before his death. He was also nearly run down by a car when he emerged from the NAACP office. Civil rights demonstrations accelerated in Jackson, Mississippi during the week of June of 1963. During that time, Evers was on TV giving a short speech, his first in Mississippi, where he kind of outlined his goals of the Jackson movement for voter registration efforts, economic boycotts, all leading to pushing against segregation and discrimination. Following that speech, the threats only increased on Evers' life. On June 12th of 1963, Evers pulled into the driveway of his home after he had met with the NAACP lawyers. When he was coming out of his car, he was carrying a box of t-shirts that actually said on them, "Jim Crow must go." Evers was shot in the back with a bullet that ricocheted into his home. It was not a question of who killed Evers. The person that did it was very known. Byron De La Beckwith was a fertilizer salesman and a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And a member of the White Citizens Council. He was arrested on June 23rd, just a couple of weeks after Evers' murder. But during the course of his first trial in 1964, Beckwith was visited by former Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett and one-time Major General Edwin A. Walker. And what we're going to find is that Beckwith, in his first trial, ended up with a deadlocked all-white jury, and there were many protests across Mississippi. So when they brought in a second all-white jury, they also failed to reach a decision, and Beckwith was set free. 3 decades later, Mississippi will reopen the case with pressure from civil rights leaders and Evers' family. In February of 1944, finally, a racially mixed jury in Jackson found Beckwith guilty of murder, and Beckwith was 73 and sentenced to life in prison. He'll die in 2001. So it just shows this long period of time where it took to bring justice to someone who was so pivotal in the movement. In response to his murder and the miscarriage of justice that we see, we'll see musicians like Bob Dylan, who wrote the song "Only a Pawn in Their Game" about the assassination. We'll see other songs such as "Too Many Martyrs" and "Another Country" be written in response to the killing. Matthew Jones and the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, freedom singers will pay tribute to Evers in the Ballad of Medgar Evers. And in there are lyrics that mention the shot in Evers' back in her song, It Isn't Nice. And that'll be sang by Malvina Reynolds. So you see this acknowledgement that this assassination was wrong, that people knew who killed him, and justice was not carried out. A story that we hear often in today's time. In 2017, the home where Evers was assassinated will be marked as a national landmark. Last week we talked about Kennedy. Kennedy will also be assassinated in 1963. In November of 1963, JFK was looking ahead to the upcoming election, which was going to take place in 1964, and he was beginning his re-election campaign. Kennedy had traveled to Texas to rally support. Texas was a turning red state. I know it's hard to think of Texas as a swing state, and I'm not necessarily labeling it as a swing state, but since the Civil War, the South had been blue. We talked about this in last week's lecture, but as we see the president moving through this civil rights legislation, you're going to see people in the South who still tie their roots to the Confederacy, to slavery, using the Confederate flag as a symbol of intimidation in the movement against the civil rights movement. You'll see people in the South, large populations, pushing towards the Republican Party. So Kennedy knows that he needs to win Texas. He needs to get that support, even knowing his vice presidential candidate is Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas. He still has to go and rally that support. So he's starting that re-election campaign down there. Lee Harvey Oswald will fire on the president's motorcade as it traveled through the city of Dallas. Oswald is said to have fired 3 times, the third shot hitting the president in the back of the head. Kennedy will be rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The picture that you see on your screen there down at the bottom is Lyndon B. Johnson, who was sworn in as the next president before leaving Dallas. Now, 2 days later, we are going to have Oswald being moved to a different jail. This will be on TV. People wanted to see what was happening. They wanted to be involved. People were obsessed with the Kennedys, obviously as president, but because of the whole kind of fairy tale of the Kennedys. We'll be watching this movement of Oswald on the TV. Jack Ruby, live on television, will shoot and kill Lee Harvey Oswald. This will be the first time people had seen someone actually be killed on TV. Police had no information on the assassination of the president at that time because Oswald hadn't, confessed his whole idea to them yet. So Johnson is going to appoint appoint the Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren, who we're also going to talk about this week, to investigate the assassination. The Warren Commission is put together and found that Jack Ruby worked alone when he killed Oswald, that there was no foreigner or American involved in the conspiracy to commit the crime. Since Kennedy's assassination, we are also going to see a lot of conspiracies come out. I know that there are tons out there. We could spend an entire week talking about the conspiracy theories around Kennedy's assassination. But the Warren Commission will also find and state that there was only one that committed the crime against Kennedy as well, and that is Lee Harvey Oswald. What leads to those conspiracy theories, the books and the movies, is that in 1979, the commission is going to rule that there was probably one more shooter in the Kennedy assassination, which leads to people going on to those conspiracy theories that we see today. And all you have to type in on the internet is JFK conspiracy theory, and you will hear the many different ideas that there were multiple shooters from different angles, that Lee Harvey Oswald was a fall guy. There are so many. And if you're interested, we can have that conversation anytime. We are going to see Johnson come into the presidency next, which we will talk about in the next section of our notes. The next assassination that we are looking at is Malcolm X. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925. He is going to be the son of a Baptist preacher who advocated the black nationalist ideas of Marcus Garvey. He and his family will face threats from the Ku Klux Klan, which forced his family to move to Michigan, where his father will continue to preach his controversial sermons despite the threats against the family. In 1931, Malcolm's father is going to be murdered by the white supremacist Black Legion, and the Michigan authorities will refuse to prosecute any of those responsible. In 1937, Malcolm was taken from his family by welfare caseworkers, and by the time he reached school age, he had dropped out of school and moved to Boston, where he became increasingly involved in criminal activities. In 1946, at the age of 21, he is going to be sent to prison on a burglary conviction. While in prison, he will encounter the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, whose members were pretty popularly known as Black Muslims. The Nation of Islam will advocate for black nationalism and racial separatism, meaning that the white and black races should be separated, basically to coexist, not to intermingle. This Nation of Islam will condemn Americans of European descent as immoral devils. Muhammad's teachings had a pretty strong effect on Malcolm, who after this is going to enter into a pretty intense program of self-education on the Nation of Islam. He will also take the last name X during this time to symbolize his stolen African identity. Okay, so his name will change during that prison sentence to Malcolm X. He was in prison for 6 years. When he is released from prison, he becomes a loyal and effective minister in the Nation of Islam, settling in Harlem, New York. He'll be contrasted, kind of pushed to the opposite end of the spectrum as Martin Luther King. Malcolm X is going to advocate for self-defense and the liberation of African Americans by any means necessary. So, not really embracing that idea of civil disobedience, more pushing back. Like he says, the quote, by any means necessary. He'll be a pretty fiery orator, speaker, and he'll be admired by the African American community in New York and around the country. In the early 1960s, he is going to become more outspoken on the philosophy of Elijah Muhammad, who felt that he did not specifically support the civil rights movement. And this is where we start to see kind of a crack between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. In late 1963, Malcolm X is going to comment on JFK's assassination, and he's going to say that it was a matter of the chickens coming home to roost. And that is going to indicate to Elijah Muhammad that Malcolm X had become too powerful, and based on that comment, it'll create an opportunity to suspend him from the Nation of Islam. A few months later, Malcolm X is going to formally leave the organization, and he'll make a pilgrimage to Mecca, where he has a pretty big breakthrough on this pilgrimage. and and start to see kind of a different way of life, of speaking, of acting. He's going to return from that pilgrimage to America with a different name. Uh, in June of 1964, he'll found the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which advocated for black identity and held that racism, not the white race, was the greatest foe of the African American. This new movement is going to steadily gain followers and kind of be a little bit more moderate of a philosophy than he had taken before. And he'll become increasingly influential to the civil rights movement, especially among those that were involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. In February of 1965, though, in New York City, Malcolm X will be assassinated by a rival black Muslim group while addressing his organization of Afro American Unity at the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights. So we will see that assassination in 1965. The next assassination that we need to talk about is Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. It is kind of creepy, to say the least, to look back. In a speech that King had made, he kind of seemed to foreshadow, predict his untimely passing, or at least made a reflective note in one of his speeches, because he ended it with the now historic words that I'm sure when I read these you've heard it before. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land, and I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. It's crazy to think about that he said those words, and it pushes him to to have us kind of look back and think, did he know something that we didn't know? There will be opposition to King's passing. Um, he did not have the followers that agreed with the way he wanted to go about the civil rights movement. The idea of not striking back with violence was not popular. He will even move his movement to include aiding working poor, which is a group that not only included black Americans but white Americans as well. And some of those that were loyal to his following were very upset that he was kind of shifting his aim, and instead of just pushing for the civil rights movement, that he will also move into kind of the working movement. And he'll work with the Memphis, Tennessee sanitation workers who were on strike. And this is where we are going to see kind of where we're going to see the strife against King's change in his practices, his support, his pathway come to him. By the time he gets assassinated, King had already survived an assassination attempt, which was in the shoe section of Harlem department store in September of 1958. That incident had only pushed him deeper into the belief of nonviolence. But after giving his speech for the Memphis sanitation workers at their strike. At 6:05 the following day, King will be standing on the second floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, where he and his associates were staying, when a sniper's bullet will strike him in the neck. He will be rushed to the hospital, but he'll be pronounced dead an hour later at the age of 39. This news of King's death is going to spark rioting in more than 100 cities around the country that included burning and looting. And this is during the time where Lyndon B. Johnson was president, and he will urge Americans to reject the blind violence that had killed King, who he called the apostle of nonviolence, to try to get people to see that this violence after his death was not something that he would have supported. People, black and white, will mourn King's passing. The killing in some ways kind of served to widen the rift between black and white Americans, because many black Americans saw King's assassination as the rejection of their vigorous pursuit of equality through the nonviolent resistance he had championed for. His murder, like the killing of Malcolm X in 1965, will radicalize many moderate African American activists, which goes to fuel the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party that we talked about last week, that really comes about in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And the deaths of these leaders only fuel the idea that nonviolence was not getting the job done. And it will push the civil rights movement in a different direction. It's interesting to think back and what could the movement have become, what could have been done had King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, all of these people, had they not been killed, even JFK had not been killed. Where would we be as a country today? Would we be seeing some of the things that we see so often today? It kind of creates a big question mark for us. There was a campaign to establish a national holiday in King's honor that began almost immediately after his death, and we know that comes about. That comes about because in 1963, Ronald Reagan will sign that in to be a national holiday. The last assassination that we have to go over is Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. After JFK is elected in 1960, he will name his brother Attorney General, that is Robert Kennedy. In his role as Attorney General, Kennedy goes on to battle corruption in the labor unions, as well as mobsters and organized crime. In 1964, while he is Attorney General, Jimmy Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering and fraud. Kennedy also supported the civil rights movement. In the fall of 1962, he will send thousands of troops to Oxford, Mississippi, to enforce the Supreme Court order admitting the first black student, who we talked about last week, James Meredith, to the University of Mississippi. Meredith was attempted to be barred from entrance to the University of Mississippi by the governor, Ross Barnett, and that enrollment had prompted riots and violence. So this action by Kennedy showed not only support for the movement, but a pushback against the actions of the South, the violent actions that were trying to stop what was being decided on, the steps that we were trying to take forward. Kennedy will go on to work with Lyndon B. Johnson on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we'll talk about in a minute. And Kennedy will act as one of JFK's closest political advisors in the White House, and was involved in important foreign policy decisions. He helped in handling the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So Kennedy was kind of perceived to many during the time that he goes to make his presidential bid as the only American in politics that was capable of uniting the people. He was beloved by the minority community for his integrity and devotion to the civil rights cause. He had won the California primary, and he was pretty much set up after that to win the Democratic nomination, and he was going to be set to face off against Richard Nixon in the general election. He will be coming out of the Greer or the Ambassador Hotel with athletes Johnson and Greer, where he will be met by Sirhan, who stepped forward with a rolled up campaign poster that was hiding a .22 revolver. He was only a foot away when he fired several shots at Kennedy. Greer and Johnson will wrestle Sirhan to the ground, but they will not be successful in the fact that 5 bystanders will also be wounded by that weapon. Sirhan was born in Palestine. He confessed to the crime in his trial, and he will receive the death sentence in March of 1969. But since the California State Supreme Court invalidated all death penalty sentences in 1972, he's just spent the rest of his life in prison. He will say in New York Times article that he believed that Kennedy was instrumental in the oppression of Palestinians, and that will be the reason for his assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. Now, this assassination is going to be post King's assassination and at the height of the Vietnam War. We needed someone like Robert F. Kennedy to unite the people, both at home because of the issues at home and because of the issues abroad. This is a time where people were really being torn apart because of what was happening in the civil rights movement, because of how people viewed the Vietnam War. And with his assassination, we see a lot of turmoil in politics. Now, the Democratic nominee ends up being someone who has zero chance at winning. And what ends up happening is that Richard Nixon will win in the general election against Hubert Humphrey in 1968, and we will see the White House changing from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. All right, we're going to kind of backtrack because this Johnson's administration is going to be happening at the same time as what we were just talking about with all of these assassinations. We kind of pick up in 1963 with Johnson when he takes over the presidency after JFK's assassination. Johnson is going to win the election in 1964, which was the one that JFK was campaigning for when he was assassinated. And he'll win with 60% of the popular vote against the Republican Party candidate, Barry Goldwater. He is going to be an experienced politician. He is going to be a Southern Democrat. He's also riding the wave of, and I say this, and I know it's a terrible way to say this, but he's also going to be riding the wave after JFK's assassination. Many of the people who supported JFK will also support LBJ. He is the exact opposite of Kennedy, where you see Kennedy with the smile, really knowing how to schmooze the audience, people. Johnson is going to be incredibly intimidating, and he is known for his intimidation tactics during the time that he served in Congress. So while he shares many of the same ideas as Kennedy, and he really takes that legacy of Kennedy and carries it on, the way in which he goes about it will be a touch different. He is going to declare a war on poverty. The war on poverty, he says, we need to take care of the 40 million Americans who live below the poverty line. He believed that in order to do this, we need to have a budget deficit in the federal government to improve the economy. In order to take care of this, he had to spend less, cut taxes, and not only cut taxes but cut government spending. And to do those at the same time is pretty tough. Uh, when he does this, though, cutting the taxes, cutting the government spending, unemployment will fall, which increases spending as planned. In March of 1964, Johnson is going to introduce what's called the Economic Opportunity Act in the Office of Economic Opportunity during one of the special messages to Congress. What he's hoping to do is help the underprivileged break the poverty cycle and help them develop job skills, further their education, and find work. In order to do this, he creates a job corps for 100,000 disadvantaged men. Half are going to work on conservation projects, and the other half are going to receive education and skills training. In addition to that, Johnson is going to task state and local governments with creating the same kind of programs at their level for up to 200,000 men and women. A national work study program is also going to be established, which offered 140,000 Americans the chance to go to college who couldn't otherwise afford it. And we're going to see some other pieces to the plan here as well. One of those pieces is the VISTA program, the Volunteers in Service to America. This partnered with Kennedy's Peace Corps program that had sent Americans to volunteer into poverty stricken communities around the world. But Johnson is going to take that same idea of the Peace Corps and apply it to American communities to solve the problem of education, medical problems, economic problems. So we're sending people into poor communities for aid. We are going to see people serving in inner city schools, in rural health clinics, urban hospitals. So basically, just taking that idea of the Peace Corps and applying it to our own cities. Some of the other initiatives in this war on poverty are a community action program for people to tackle poverty with their own communities, the ability of the government to recruit and train skilled volunteers to serve in these communities, loans and guarantees for employers who offer jobs to the unemployed, funds for farmers to purchase land and establish agricultural co-ops, help for the unemployed parents preparing to enter the workforce. And that is going to take on the face of Head Start. Head Start was used to help parents who were trying to go back to work. The Head Start program started as an 8-week summer camp run by the Office of Economic Opportunity for 500,000 children ages 3 to 5. But since it has been started, it's served over 32 million vulnerable children in America. Education reform is going to be a huge part of the Economic Opportunity Act with the Great Society. What is signed into play in 1965 was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which guaranteed federal funding for education in school districts whose students were majority low income. It also is going to fund preschool programs, support school libraries, purchase school textbooks, provide special education services. These programs are being compared to a lot of what Biden is trying to do today. He's trying to get pre-K for all accessible to everybody. We're seeing a lot of comparisons being drawn from Biden to LBJ because of what he's trying to do with relief right now. We'll see some of these ties from Biden to FDR because of how he acted during the economic crisis created by COVID. So these ideas weren't just done by Johnson and then given up on. There were many that have been carried out into today. Healthcare, big ideas in healthcare coming up here. By the time Johnson takes office, there's going to be two groups of Americans that were uninsured, the elderly and the poor. Kennedy had campaigned or championed for healthcare for the needy during his 1960s presidential campaign. But he didn't really get it done. There are going to be many Republicans, some Southern Democrats. The public support goes down, and it's going to get shot down in Congress. Johnson's going to become president. The Democrats take control of Congress in 1964, and you're going to see Medicare and Medicaid become federal law. Medicare is going to cover hospital and physician costs for the elderly. Medicaid covered healthcare costs for people getting cash assistance from the government. Both programs are going to serve as a sort of safety net for America's most vulnerable. Johnson's going to focus his attention on increasing the cost of medical care. Truman had opposed or had proposed this medical assistance for health insurance plan in his Fair Deal, but it never got passed into law. So 1965 is when we finally see this getting put into action. And these two programs, Medicare and Medicaid, are the most important pieces of social welfare legislation that have been passed since FDR's Social Security Act in 1935. These are both still in play today. The way medical costs work is if you don't have health insurance and you set foot into a hospital, every single piece that you get charged for is 100% coming out of your pocket. That is a lot of money if you don't have health insurance. That is millions of dollars for any accidents that could come into play. If people have high medical costs, that money that they are getting is going towards that debt instead of going into the economy. So while this is trying to help people, it is also a plan to help our economy as well. So kind of twofold there. Also, under Johnson, we are going to see some action taken on immigration and the environment. The Immigration Act of 1965 is going to be passed in October of 1965. What this is going to do is end immigration nationality quotas, the quotas that we talked about all the way back in the 1920s, and focus on reuniting families. Ding, ding, ding. That should sound like something that we're trying to do at the border today, and still place limits on immigrants coming in per country and total immigration. So kind of reforming what we had already in play. Johnson is also going to have to start worrying about the environment. We have some worsening water pollution that is occurring. Johnson's going to sign into play the Water Quality Act in 1965 that helped set the national water quality standards. A lot of this turning to the environment is going to come from Rachel Carson's Silent Springs. Rachel Carson's Silent Springs shows us all of the terrible things that we are doing to the environment, what we are putting out into the environment, and what effects that's having on our health, on the health of the environment around us and what we should be doing. So she paints a very vivid picture of what we have done to the world that we live in and what we need to do to start fixing it, which causes Johnson to take these actions. Another impactful book written at this time is Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed. This is going to push for some safety precautions here that are kind of tied into the environmental aspect as well. In 1965, we have the Motor Vehicle Air Pollution Control Act that formed the first vehicle emission standards. We're also going to see the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Child Safety Act, both created to help consumers as well. We have the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act here, talking about seatbelts, the fact that it's dangerous to ride in a car without a seatbelt. And that's that title, Unsafe at Any Speed. It seems like common sense now because we hear so much about it, but it was not at the time. The Johnson administration is also going to pass into law protections for wildlife, rivers, and it will form a network of scenic trails among historical landmarks. So, across the board, we're seeing a lot of different legislation being passed in the Great Society, which is what this whole program is called. The Great Society. Think about it, it makes sense. We're calling it the Great Society because we're trying to eliminate poverty, which would make our society great. This is going to be compared to the New Deal. Lots of parallels between the action, the amount of presidential action against social issues between Lyndon B. Johnson and FDR. Taking that government, the federal government, and getting it very involved in social issues. The Great Society. But not everybody is going to be satisfied or support Johnson's Great Society. Some are going to resent that the government is giving handouts and feel that the government should just butt out of American lives altogether. In 1968, Nixon is going to set out to undo or revamp much of the Great Society legislation. He and other Republicans still wanted to help the poor because, again, we can't go back after the New Deal and get the government completely uninvolved in social problems. But what the Republicans wanted to do under Nixon was put up more red tape and reduced the cost of these programs. Nixon wasn't completely successful, but some of the reform, these fights over the reform are going to rage over time and still be fighting here. He was successful in the sense that he takes action against poverty, but not successful in the sense that poverty was wiped out. Johnson will be incredibly popular for the stance that he takes against poverty. He'll even have a higher approval rating than Kennedy, but he realizes that the Great Society is never going to achieve the goal of winning the war against poverty. Much like we can't win the war in Vietnam, we couldn't win the war against poverty here in the United States. He will have a lasting impact on the future as far as politically and socially, but a lot of his success is going to be overshadowed by the war in Vietnam because the war in Vietnam is, it should say impact of Vietnam spending, not splendid. That is a typo, fix, fail. Because of the war in Vietnam, a lot of the funds that should have been dedicated to the war on poverty will be shifted to the war in Vietnam. Even though he passes a large amount of legislation, Johnson is seldom remembered as a champion for the underprivileged and at risk. Instead, he's better known as the commander-in-chief who forced America into an unwinnable war that resulted in over 58,000 American fatalities. What we do see, though, and I've mentioned this many times throughout the lecture today, is that there is a comparison drawn to today. The new president today has already signed into law a $1.9 trillion pandemic relief package known as the American Rescue Plan that also includes an array of health programs and is reaching to declare an assault on child poverty that goes right back to what Lyndon B. Johnson did with programs like Head Start, with Vista. Biden has also introduced a proposal for a $2 trillion infrastructure package, the American Jobs Plan, that would rebuild roads, bridges, and look to invest large sums of money in research and development to modernize manufacturing, retrain workers, expand home health care, improve broadband and the electrical grid. While these sound like we're taking on something new, he's kind of using a handbook of something old. A lot of people are going to draw comparisons that equate him more to Lyndon B. Johnson, but during his campaign as a candidate, Biden talked a lot about the New Deal and the achievements made there as well. There are a lot of similarities between Biden and LBJ. They're both creatures of the Senate. They come right out of the Senate, and they understand the legislative process very well because of their experience in the Senate. They understood, LBJ understood the importance of relationships. Biden understands that, and knowing that you kind of have to work across the political divide to get done what you want to get done. So the comparisons are there to look at between LBJ and FDR and LBJ and Biden, Biden and FDR. What they all have in common is that they are Democratic presidents who are pushing for federal intervention in social issues. Given the circumstances that each of these presidents were in, they have the ability to push for monumental social reform. And if you want more information on that, I will provide you with some articles, but I didn't force that reading on you. If you're interested, we can discuss. This week in class, we're going to cover the Warren Court, so get ready for some pretty awesome court cases. Don't forget about your assignments this week. You have your Journal 31, your Unit 11 document set 2, and your War on Poverty speech, all due on Friday.